A feminist reading of Debord and the Situationists. The spectacle implies spectators. Spectatorship is maintained by social exploitation and psychic repression. These two parameters first theorized by Michel Foucault. Preventing action by gradually weakening the individual through a collective force of attrition. By mentioning psychic repression, I refer to desires and how they are molded, deflected, and channeled by the spectacle, such that the spectacle diverts every action of survival into the commodity system to reproduce the economy of alienated power. Alienation in the sense of Marx, which is basic separation from what one produces, ownership of production. Feminists say that the personal is political, and the agents of the spectacle trivialize and dismiss the reality of the statement, making politics into the mechanisms of the state. But in actuality, the state is a socioeconomic entity, because the social, that is the personal, is defined by economic activity, which is in turn maintained in an interplay with the state, the socioeconomic state of the commodity spectacle society, in Debordian terms, from which nothing today escapes: integration. Even the most personal and intimate today becomes a commodity that is something to be exchanged, especially for a profit. We are allowed a greater degree of so-called sexual freedom and expression. For example, in exchanging our sexual labor to produce a value for our sexual partner that defines them as an individual within and helps their survival such that it reproduces. The spectacle and its accumulation of the great capital. The personal is political, and that personhood becomes capital. The original meaning of capital being head, as in a person. And because capital motivates so-called alienated power in the Marxist sense, and extending its longevity as the agency of the socioeconomic state, also known as the spectacle. Personhood becomes image, and image becomes representation. The spectacle channels representation as the movements of commodities as blocks of time, mediating personal interaction and survival as a political vehicle, and isolating personhood as groups of political vehicles, in turn reproducing the spectacle with consumption. The political implications of this commodity exchange escaping perception, but seen as an apolitical form of personal expression. But remember that there is no so-called apolitical, because any idea or norm which fosters inertia is automatically pro-status quo. The personal is political in that every personal desire becomes capital spent on a block of time. This personal capital being spent collectively as the great capital to be owned by so-called alienated power in the Marxist sense. Expressing the agency of the spectacle and reproducing itself and extending its reach to mediate ever greater personal desires, the great capital of the spectator, who is allowed to act upon desire only insofar as this desire is actually the desire of the spectacle, recuperated by so-called alienated power, which is separation from one's own power in the reproduction of capital. So-called sexual freedom becomes the freedom of the spectacle to mediate personal desire and reproducing itself at a profit for alienated power. Belief is a commodity exchange in the flourishing market of ideas, a personal identity, and its implications and expectations again being isolated as a political vehicle of consumption for alienated power. To have a belief is to purchase and exchange the commodities of this belief as personal capital, like social capital, which is to say,
the capital city of the United States is Washington, D.C.
Especially ideology, becoming the great capital. In short, any belief that is internalized by personhood can be recuperated by the spectacle, such that even a conviction of resistance makes the person an agent of the spectacle and ultimately a spectator to irreversible history. The personal is political, and politics in the form of social exploitation and psychic repression, as first determined by Foucault, should be destroyed. This would be replaced by the personal empowerment of radical subjectivity, in that personhood as a subject that acts upon an object changes society at the roots. Personhood is then no longer a political spectatorship, nor is it a channeling of desire into the so-called great capital to be exploited by alienated power, which is separation from one's own power within the spectacle, and the commodity of desire at its socioeconomic base.